Look at this picture. What is it used for? Look at it, study it, take some guesses. And by the end of this recording, I'll give you the answer. In colonial America, most people were farmers. Either they were farming or they made a living from a business that aided farmers, such as grinding wheat into flour in a mill, or geography played an important role in determining what a group of people did for a living. For instance, in New England, the winters were long and the soil was rocky. Farmers there could barely produce enough to feed their families. This is subsistence farming. Children on the farm were an important source of labor. A typical farming day began as soon as the sun rose. Boys helped their dad mend fences, till land, plant and harvest new crops, and tend to livestock. Girls helped their mother cook, they cleaned house, and made soap and candles, as well as managed the family garden. Girls put up food for the winter. Girls were not, however, taught to read or write. Mills and lumber yards were powered by water. People in the towns made furniture, shoes, guns, and horseshoes. In New England, many people built ships and fished for a living. Most people in the middle colonies were farmers. The climate was mild and they had moderately long growing seasons. And they had bigger harvests than the New England colonies. They sowed cash crops such as wheat, but mainly produced staple crops, crops that formed the basis of a diet. Here in Louisiana, rice is a staple crop because it's in almost everything we eat. They also had some industries, but not as much as New England, and they had people from many cultures that located there. Today we call this cultural diversity. The southern colonies had a rich soil, a warm climate, and a very long growing season. The soil was rich because when snow melted up north, it was carried by the water of the melting snow to the Mississippi River, that later deposited on the ground in the south when the Mississippi River flooded. The south had excellent conditions for growing crops. They produced cash crops like rice and indigo and tobacco. In the south, most people farmed or worked on farms. There was very little industry. Southern farmers had plantations, large farms that were usually built by a river so they could transport their goods. Tobacco was a principal crop in areas like Maryland and Virginia. At first, they used indentured servants, people who were paying off a debt by working for someone. But later, as the demand increased, they turned to using slaves that they bought from the Dutch. Before slavery ever existed in the South, it had already been in practice in West Africa. Tribes in West Africa captured and enslaved other Africans and eventually sold some of them to the Dutch, who in turn sold them to the colonies. The trip from Africa to the New World was a torturous one. Slaves were stacked as high as they could be with very little fresh air. The voyage became known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is part of a triangular trade between England, Africa, the West Indies, and America. Once in America, most slaves worked on the fields. Many colonies had slave codes to govern their behavior of slaves. For example, slaves were not permitted to leave the plantation without the owner's written permission. Okay, now for our question. Pictured here is a collar that was put around the neck of a recaptured runaway slave. The collar's job was to catch the slave as he ran through the woods on branches and brushes, and therefore would slow him down and he could be recaptured. It is, however, in a final note, not all colonists believed in slavery. Quakers and Puritans were not in favor of slavery. And additionally, there were a number of free African Americans that lived and prospered in the New World.